Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and I'm going to talk about the best places to put your beehives. And so I was just going to give some guidelines today about where you should put your hives, and then if you're really passionate about beekeeping, then where you should eventually, look for new bee yards. What are the requirements for that? So, where should you put your hives on your own property? The basic hive location, it's important to have full sun if possible. This just gets your bees working better, and since they have more area to work with, the sun just helps them because there's a lot more light and it warms up the hive, so they have to do less work during the summer and the winter. While it may not be an advantage during this summer, if you live in the south, it definitely is in the north because we want those bees to get going early in the morning if possible. They can get more work done. Ideally it's facing south because that is it will give them the morning sun that they need. Is it absolutely crucial? No. These are all preferences. If you can get these, that's great. If you can't, that's also fine. So these are all suggestions, and your bees won't die because they don't have these hive or important parts when you're deciding where to put them. One thing that I will say is probably a non-negotiable is flooding. So if you know that this place can flood, like even once every 10 years or 20 years, do not put your bees there. It's a terrible idea. You don't want to, kill your colony because it floods. My family's whole property, it's like a big bowl with two big hills. Our driveway is one hill, the other side of our driveway is another hill, and at the bottom there's a creek. And every spring, and typically in the late winter, it will flood. And so we considered putting bees down there when we first started, but we knew that it could sometimes flood and it wasn't worth it. In the past 5 years, the hives would have been taken out at least a couple times due to the flood water, because sometimes it gets extremely high. I post about it on my Instagram. Some of the stories are crazy. It's just so high certain times of the year. So do not put your bees in a place where they're at risk of flooding. It's really important. It's not hard where I live in Maine because we have so many hills and just a lot of areas that aren't flat. But if you live in a more flood prone area, it's something that's really important to think about. Then also, not just with flooding, it's good if the hives are in a place that's pretty flat. It just makes it easier to feed and a lot easier to this, because let's say you have a great beekeeping year, which I hope you all do, and you've stacked on 4 or 5, 6 supers. You'd have to be in a great honey location, but eventually maybe you could get one hive that's really, really tall. And if you have a single deep or 2 deeps and then 3+ supers, it gets really tall and relatively unstable. Although it is very heavy, which helps it stay in place, it's better if it's flat, and that way you don't have any tipping when you get the boxes stacked really high. And then if it's ideal to be in an area where you don't have like sitting water. So maybe it doesn't flood there, but if there's sitting water there pretty frequently, that's really not good, because it means that you're going to constantly be sogging through water, and it can cause some problems in the hive when it's that wet around the hives. And it's just for convenience sake, you're more likely to slip and get mud all over your bee suit, and it's just mud on the equipment. It's just easier if you have a place that's drier and doesn't have sitting water. Some places might have it in the spring, and if it's only for a short period of time, who cares? But if it's year-round, pretty close, then it's probably not the best idea to put bees there. And probably the most important thing that I didn't entirely consider when I started is convenience. You may only be starting with 1, 2 hives this year, but it does make it a lot easier when you have the hives close to where you're storing your equipment, because it may not seem like a big deal to carry out 1 box when you're on your first hive or 2, but it absolutely matters when you've got 5, 6, 10 colonies there. And beekeeping is obsessive, so there's a decent chance you're going to be at least 5. So Consider how much effort you want to put in carrying the boxes. My basement is very far away from where my hives are. So it takes a long time to walk up and down these hills up over to my hives. And so if you don't have like an ATV or some kind of vehicle to carry your equipment to the hives, which is great if you do, but if you don't, it's ideal to put your hives in a place that's close to where you're carrying your equipment out, because one weekend you may be carrying out 5 boxes, and even if they don't have honey in them, it's just a pain in the butt. It's really frustrating to have to carry out so many boxes and frames. It makes life a lot harder. So put your hives in a place that's close to where you're storing equipment, and also consider that you're going to be carrying full boxes of honey. And a medium super of honey is still about 30 pounds. And so if you have to carry that a few hundred yards, that's not easy. And especially if it's not great terrain. Like I said, my house, maybe at some point, hopefully I'll get a drone and I can show you, but it's just hill everywhere. There's not a single flat spot on my entire property. In the hills, there's just so many hills. So having your beekeeping equipment close to where you want to have your hives is really what you should aim to do. The wind. It sucks heat away from colonies. So it might feel good on you when you're in a hot, sweaty bee suit during the summer, but it's not going to be good for the bees when it's 30 miles an hour and it's 5 degrees outside. So you want to have a wind block. Are your bees going to die without a wind block? No. I had a very windy apiary that I got last year, and it's still one of my strongest apiaries. And the one that has no wind, I've lost 3 out of the 5 colonies there. So it's not really about just one thing, but these are all things that you, if possible, do benefit your bees. So if you have a natural wind block of some trees coming from whatever direction that you most commonly get wind, that would be good for your bees. Makes them a lot less angry when you're opening them, because the wind just annoys them and they get mad at you when it's windy. And you'll be able to inspect them in colder temperatures if you need to. It's not a good idea to, but sometimes it's really necessary. And so if you have less wind, then it's easier to inspect them and they'll be less angry at you. And if you do have a lot of wind and you're interested in making a wind block, I think there are definitely some solutions. I've heard of like using bales of straw and like pallets, but I don't know much about that. Comment down below if you know anything about wind blocks for bees. I would like to have one in that one yard. It'll make it easier to film and just be better for the bees, but I am unsure. I don't have much experience with that. So let me know down below what you've done for wind blocks. So part 2 of this video is going to be about how to find an apiary. So apiaries, some beekeepers love it so much they just have to have more bees. And for me personally, I only want about 5 colonies in a yard. Do I need more yards? No, because some people keep as many as 50 colonies in a yard. But I think it'll be fun just to see, how the different yards do. And also robbing is less of an issue when you have a less amount of colonies in a yard. So that's part of the reason why I do it. But also I'm just interested in the honey, if it's any different, if it's better. Those are all things that interest me. So that's part of the reason why I have 3 apiaries already, including the one at my house, and then I want to get a 4th this year. So when you're looking for an apiary, by far and away the most important thing, and this is not just for me, I've heard a million other beekeepers say this, is access, access, access. If you don't have very close access to your bees, it's so frustrating. When I was looking for my first apiary, I was like, oh, I'll walk across the field, oh, it won't be a big deal. But it absolutely matters. It is a big deal. So you want a road right next to where you're putting your hives so you can get equipment in efficiently and add takeaway boxes. Just make it convenient for you to get into that bee yard and for you to move equipment. Both of my yards that I currently have are about, maybe 20 feet from a road, and I can get in there year round. So even in the winter time, if I need to get feed on, or during mud season, the roads aren't bad. So you want to think about how much access you have throughout the year, and especially during the mud season, spring. It depends on where you are. Some places it will really matter to be in your bees that time of year. Other places it won't. So just consider your environment and how much mud you get and when you get it compared to when the bee season is. Number two for your apiary, just like the other looking for your own hives, you ideally want to have more sun and less wind because both of them just help your bees. So find that place that ideally has less sun and more, or has more sun and less wind. Then if you are putting your bees on an area near farmers or on a farm, you definitely need to talk to them and make sure that they're not spraying any chemicals that your bees will be damaged by, and that if they are, then just plan to move them before that crop is sprayed, and that way you can get ahead of any potential problems. I haven't had any kill-offs from bees or from pesticides on my bees, but it's probably only a matter of time. It's just, you have to communicate really well and hope that nobody's spraying something 3 miles away that you haven't talked to, because you just can't control that. So that is important to think about when you're putting down an apiary. Then lastly, it comes to the landlord. So on the Honeybee Obscura podcast, Kim Flottam and Jim too, they were talking about this same topic, I think last spring. And they were talking about how you want to have an apiary or an outyard where your bees, where you don't have to talk to the landowner every time. So if you have to drive right by their house and they're people who want to talk to you every time, you're going to be much less likely to go to that apiary and try to work your bees there. So they will suffer, since you will feel like it's not worth it to go out there because you're going to get stopped and you have to talk to them for a while. So if you have an apiary where you don't have to necessarily talk to the landowner every time, I'm not saying don't ever do it or don't give them honey, but just to make it more convenient so you don't have to be stopped by them and delay your work every time. Because sometimes you just need to get in and get out and be done. So.